Il Papa, the Pope. He's a jolly man in a funny hat that just so happens to lead the largest sect in Christianity today. Recently, the Pope has been delegated to a diplomatic role, helping to ease tensions between warring factions, calling on countries to give aid to disaster-struck areas, and generally serving as a well-liked public figure. But what were the popes like before? Who were these men that helped lead Catholicism down through the ages and into what they are today? What is the Pope? The Pope is the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, also known as the Vicar of Christ. His authority is taken from the concept known as apostolic succession, a concept first introduced by Irenaeus in the late 2nd century. This concept declares that the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is the spiritual successor to Peter, even as Peter and the apostles were the successor to Christ. Augustine of Hippo later on solidified and really brought this concept to its modern form. Catholics claim their succession from Peter, whom they claim as the chief apostle of Christ, down through an unbroken chain of succession to the very Pope today, Francis. The issue with this is actually twofold. We don't know if any of the earliest popes actually even existed or not. With the exception of 3 of them, Peter, Linus, and Clement, who are mentioned in the New Testament and the writings of Paul, no one else is found anywhere, with possibly the exception of Clement from his own writings, but we're not even sure if those writings were written by him or not. We actually find, with the possible exception of Peter, Linus, and Clement, the first 12 popes were more than likely the complete fabrication by Irenaeus, who was working to counter claims made by rival Christian cults at the time. His book, Against Heresies, was found to be full of factual misinformation and lies when the library of Nag Hammadi was uncovered in 1945. The other church historian who wrote about the earliest church and its leaders was Eusebius, who blatantly writes that it is okay to lie when it is useful and for posterity. The formation and origins, then, of the early Catholic Church must therefore be called into question. But that's not even the worst of it. The second is this whole concept of apostolic succession, from Jesus to Peter to the invented popes, down to the current pope today. The earliest idea that hints at this is from Clement of Rome, the aforementioned possible pope, in his writings, but his interchanging of bishop and presbyter does still lead some to debate his intent. The idea was formulated from Matthew 16:18 and was taken by the early church fathers as a means of guaranteeing the truth when they taught. Naturally, every church, of course, claimed this, though the popes in Alexandria required a congregation of presbyters to elect their bishop, while other churches required a physical laying on of hands to give an heir, so to speak. Obviously, the early church didn't agree on any of this. It wasn't until Augustine of Hippo came around and solidified the idea of a transference of grace by laying on of hands, an idea that wasn't really widely present at the time. Before then, all ideas of apostolic succession, mostly, centered around the idea of giving authority to speak, teach, and tell the truth. Catholics hold to this papal supremacy, a sort of pipeline of succession model, in which Christ gave his apostles the authority to preach, and Peter was given authority over the other apostles. Therefore, the Church of Rome, which claimed Peter as its founder, claimed direct apostolic succession from Peter himself. And they were even so kind as to provide all of the documents and lists of popes previous, all the way back to Peter himself, to prove their claim. Wasn't that kind of them? Because of this, the Church of Rome was able to claim apostolic supremacy over the other churches while still acknowledging the validity of the other sees, and thus were able to wrestle power from Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem at the time. Thus, the Papacy of Rome was established, though the title of Papa, or Pope, was actually not used until Damasus I in 366. Indeed, the popes only started gaining true power in the 8th century, under the guise of a forgery called the Donation of Constantine, which supposedly ceded the western part of the Roman Empire to the Bishop of Rome. The paper was not discovered to be a forgery until the 14th century, but by that point it was too late. The papacy had started its rise to total dominion over the Christian world, a position of power that would be fought over, sometimes brutally. The first pope, he got the job, Damasus, by murdering his rival's gang. And that rivalry would last for 15 years, to a point where he had to travel about Rome with armed guards. The Secularum Obscurum, the Dark Ages of the papacy, it was a time of murder, intrigue, and nepotism. By the time of the Renaissance, however, the papacy was dependent upon the revenue of the papal states, and this led to conflict between the popes and rival nobility. Indeed, Julius II, the man who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, he was known as the Warrior Pope for his brutal and bloody military campaigns to win back the papal states. And this was costly. It was so costly, in fact, that the sale of indulgences was actually increased at his command to pay for the beautiful art and architecture that is so evocative of the Renaissance period. Those beautiful paintings and awe-inspiring monuments to God, those were bought with the promise of salvation to poor, pious believers. The Renaissance popes were known for their shrewd diplomatic prowess, and one only has to say the name Borgia to conjure up all kinds of salacious ideas. That would be Alexander VI, in case you were wondering. He was a Borgia. But after the 1500s and the Counter-Reformation, the Pope began to take on more of a spiritual leader rather than a secular ruler. Maybe this was because they simply couldn't compete. But nonetheless, this trend continued on until today, where we now have a man with no army, a country listed officially as the smallest in the world, and its leader is a man that is universally liked and respected as a spiritual leader and a champion of the poor and the needy. Say what you want about Catholicism and its history, from lying zealots, pimps and thugs, warriors, serene diplomats, you have to admit, it is one hell of a story. Successful!